Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. It's KAZU. This is broadcast number 558. It's August the 16th, 1982. I have to write the date down. It goes so fast. I don't know how 1 week from the other. It goes so quickly. There's a program on this station for local people who listened before called International Forum, and they were discussing problems and conflict in Lebanon. And I was going to discuss the Lebanon crisis and the Israeli role there. I put it off till next week because the large subject of Ronald Reagan and World War III and the Lebanon crisis I thought should come together. And I'll give some viewpoints that I have on the subject. And I mentioned to a gentleman here in the studio while the program was on that the discussion of what's going on with the heads of states in Israel or Egypt or Lebanon is very academic, and it's sort of like talking to the tooth fairy. It's a question of who's going to be in charge of the government, how far will they go, what is the future of the PLO. But the subject that is never brought out seriously and laid on the table surgically is the role of narcotics money, narcotics traffic, getting certain politicians in to flow the buck, whether it's through Afghanistan or the banks in Lebanon, and Israeli, the share of the narcotics it will throw through Lebanon, that they will have a piece of the profit to fund their arms if they need them later. The drug traffic is the largest single industry in the United States today. It's larger than any General Motors or Ford. Well, the motor companies are going bankrupt, but the flow of narcotics is a multi-billion-dollar business, and I have the statistics at home, current ones, and they're always updated. And yet, how this money is made, how it gets to this country, how it flows, whether it flows from Southeast Asia, escalated during the Vietnamese War, Southeast Asian War, or from Pakistan or Turkey or Colombia or Bolivia or Mexico, the traffic flow is divided between certain heads of states. When Ronald Reagan was running for president against Jimmy Carter, I said you have the choice of two drug lords. You can either get the South American connection or the Middle East connection, and their tentacles go to the people who support these men, put them into office. The men such as Paul Laxalt and Frank Sinatra, with their close links to organized crime, or the links to Ronald Reagan's administration, or that Mr. Zipkin I talked about a few weeks ago, the gopher for Nancy Reagan. The drug people around Jimmy Carter was Mr. Jordan, Hamilton Jordan, and the Trujillo's connections in Panama, and over to Libya and the Middle East through various tentacles. The drug connection is divided as closely as the Cola Wars or the Pepsi-Cola Wars. There is a book out called The Cola Wars describing the Pepsi-Cola group that line up with the Republicans, basically, and the Coca-Cola people. And the drug market is divided with candidates and public officials. And we'll talk next week. Hopefully there won't be any major crisis, and I'll go into some of the details of the politics of Lebanon and Israel with regards to the drug market. Now, a book was advertised yesterday, in all the major newspapers, in the magazine of the major newspapers of the United States. It's called Conspiracy in Dallas. The author isn't listed here. It's Fairchild Publishing, $4, and you can write to Box 663, Waskom, Texas, WASKOM, Texas, 75692, $4. And the story, the blurb advertising the book says, now it can be told Lee Harvey Oswald was not the assassin of President John F. Kennedy or Officer J.D. Tippit. He was part of a conspiracy in the FBI and the CIA and the State Department. He played the role of an informant. Now, I've done 20 years, almost 20 years this November, of research on this subject. I'm anxious to get the book. It was just, as I say, advertised yesterday nationally. I'll read it, evaluate it, and give you a critique on it as soon as they send it. I think they said the delivery is 4 weeks, so we have to wait for that, but I'll compare it to my research and see how it comes down. I've been very hard on the Vatican and the links of the Vatican to the mafia, again, the drug traffic, and the various banking institutions in the United States, and the Banco Ambrosiano collapsing and starting a major scandal around the world involving 230 banks. I'm going to get off their back for a while this evening. I'm going to lay off the Vatican financial crisis and talk about the periphery relating to it, and tell you there is a new book coming out. It was written in the New York Times, not the Washington Post, New York Times, August the 7th. Holt, Reinhardt, and Winston, they're publishing a book by Richard Hammer, and it's called The Vatican Connection, the astonishing account of $1 billion counterfeit deal between the mafia and the church. Now, we know, as I left off the program last week, and it's still true, the Vatican has signed notes for 1.2 or 4 billion in Panama banks, 10 banks that are dummy fronts, and also Mr. Marcinkus of the Vatican, the chief treasurer, resigned from the Nassau Bahama Bank when the scandal broke. But in addition to Mae Brussell doing this work, there are many people putting these pieces together. I hope you don't think that I'm anti-Catholic or anti-Jewish or anti-Mormon. And I'm really going to hit the Jewish dope dealers in Israel next week and their role in narcotics traffic and their interest in this war of dividing the narcotic traffic in the Middle East with Lebanon when they clean out the PLO. But this particular book that's coming out goes into the fact that there are mafia connections, counterfeit stock, billions of dollars floating around, and they locate, according to a mention of this book, it has to do with a scandal in Munich, Germany, and many hundreds of millions will be described in this book. There's just a brief mention of it apropos of the New York Times articles this week. Also in the New York Times, there is a story, the U.S. inquiry into 1973 at the Vatican Bank is disclosed. Now, 2 weeks ago, I had on the air the scandal of the Vatican and Paul Marcinkus and Mr. Menini, the Vatican financiers, being involved with a bank in New Jersey. And I'll do more on that bank in a few minutes. But 1967, they were involved with putting $30 million from Rome into these banks and then giving interest, low interest or no interest at all loans to FBI agents in New York, in New Jersey, and in Miami, which are the hubs of the drug traffic. They were at the time, pouring in from New York and New Jersey and Miami. And the FBI was being paid off with loans that they didn't have to pay back. And one expose, just one New York Times article mentioned $1 million loan, but goodness knows how many. So in 1967, there were the same people that are being served warrants now involved in bank in New Jersey. In 1973, prior to the Watergate arrests, there was an investigation into by the FBI in organized crime and into certificates that were forged, and it involved Archbishop Marcinkus. His name emerged in tape recordings and wire recordings, and he was linked to mafia connections and drug traffic as early as 1973. As I say, he was linked in 67, but again in 73. And Richard Nixon's administration put the lid on it. Well, Michael Sindona, who's now in jail and involved with Marcinkus and the Vatican, had allegedly offered $1 million to Maurice Stans and Richard Nixon, and there's no reason to believe they didn't take it. So in 1967, the New York Times was writing about Paul Marcinkus. In 1973, they were. Then 1974, the Franklin National Bank broke in New York City with $45 million missing. Now, the Bank Ambrosiano in Italy has collapsed. The Milan Bank has collapsed. They're going to start over with a new bank, and they're very original. They're going to call it the Nuovo Banco Ambrosiano. Nuovo means new in Italian. I guess the same, almost the same in Spanish, the Nuevo Ambrosiano. I'm sure that somebody's going to figure out it's the same Ambrosiano. They didn't change the name. One other article that came out of New Solidarity, before I get off the subject, was that Margaret Thatcher was in Rome, Italy, and was asked by a newsman about the links of the Bank of London to Roberta Calvi and laundering dirty mafia money through the Grandmother Lodge of England, headed by the Queen of England's cousin, the Duke of Kent. Margaret Thatcher got very angry at the interview, of course, and the report says that Calvi expose shakes Maggie. It isn't very often that somebody from the news media can confront Margaret Thatcher about the murder in London of Roberta Calvi, and because the British banks are missing so much money, it must be a very sensitive subject to all of them, and we've talked about some of those scandals. last week I talked about Helene vonDamm getting a promotion, and I want to mention one article about her in the paper this week. Helene vonDamm is the personal secretary to Ronald Reagan. She's now been promoted to make the appointments of the White House. She's the director of presidential personnel. She's got this new appointment. And Jack Anderson mentioned in a column of his that the Republicans and people in Washington close to Ronald Reagan are angry at Helene vonDamm. She's only been there a couple of years in Washington. She was out here 8 years with Ronald Reagan at his right hand, making appointments. But she's getting the Republicans worked up and angry at her appointments. And he cited one person, I don't know who he is, in Boston, that she promoted, a man by the name of Albert Dapper O'Neill. And she insisted that he become the U.S. Marshal in Boston. And the gist of the Jack Anderson article was that Helene vonDamm is ambitious and pulling too much weight, outspoken and ambitious. It took a long time. She's been in public life about 10 years now, or tried to hide, but they're finally catching on. Well, I mentioned on the air that Helene vonDamm's second husband is a banker in Germany, and that her current husband, Byron Leeds, is living, the second husband partly is in Germany. He's a banker in Germany. And her third husband, Byron Leeds, that she married last year, is in New Jersey. And I wrote Helene a letter this week. I don't think she'll appreciate it, but I think it's pertinent, and I think it's time that somebody speak up in this country and let those people know that we know who they are and we know their background and we want more about them. So I wrote August the 8th to Helene vonDamm in care of the White House. That's where her appointment office is. And this is what I said. Dear Helene vonDamm, I read in the Los Angeles Times, May 13th, 1981, that your second husband, Christian vonDamm, was a German international banker, and he still is. This same article mentioned your third husband, Byron Leeds, who lives in New Jersey. Would you please tell me, a simple taxpayer, I didn't say we're paying her salary, I said a simple taxpayer, and a curious researcher, which bank or banks Christian vonDamm is affiliated with? Because there are many scandals. I didn't put this in the letter, of course, but I want to know what banks in Germany he works for or which bank. And then I said I would appreciate knowing what city your current husband, Byron Leeds, lives in. I want to know whether it's Newark or which city in New Jersey he lives in, because she was protecting Raymond Donovan as Secretary of Labor, and he has a list of crime syndicate friends going down to the Cosa Nostra, the Genoveses, the Gambinos. And I want to know what headquarters Byron Leeds lives in, and then we can locate more about where he works. I didn't ask her that. I put in the letter, every American citizen should be informed of these two important persons. Because of your close association with Raymond Donovan, I said that, and with Roy Cohn and Lynn Nofziger, I am not certain of your personal background. She's a business partner in property with Lynn Nofziger, and he was the liaison of John Mitchell to the Nazi Party out here in California and around the country during the election of Richard Nixon. I continued, as an appointed official of the Reagan administration, and she is appointed, she's not elected, with close ties to the Italian-Argentine Licio Gello, Ronald Reagan's ties, it is important to know what German bank or banks and New Jersey contacts you keep. I think you can see my concern. As I understand, you were secretary for Otto Albrecht von Bolschwing. He was a Nazi that came over here with the OSS and the CIA. How many Reinhard Gehlen agents permeated this nation, and how far does it go? Does it go to the White House selection of appointments? I am sending a copy of this letter to President Ronald Reagan. Members of Congress should be informed of these past 100% Nazi ties, especially with the appointment of J. Peter Grace recently. Thank you in advance for your honesty. I'm sure you have nothing to hide, espionage related, especially with William Clark counterintelligence agents from Vienna and Switzerland. He brought her to this country. Do I sound concerned about this in D.C.? You bet I am. So any letter from you about your two husbands will satisfy my possible paranoia that your appointments could be Nazi related. Thank you, Mae Brussell. Now, in lieu of that, I mailed that August the 8th, and in the San Francisco Chronicle this morning, following along those lines, there's a bitter fight in the White House. Alexander Haig said that there was guerrilla warfare against him, and he's out. But the fighting of the teams, of the espionage links and the assassination teams, are tangling each other for power. And there's a long article today on the bitter fight in the White House, and this is very important because they will actually literally drop Ronald Reagan. He'll go bananas over this conflict, and something has to happen soon because there literally is no president making decisions, and the conflict is between James Baker, the chief of staff, who was a campaign manager of George Bush, who has close relations, the family with the Hinckley family. James Baker became the head of staff for Ronald Reagan, and Edwin Meese, who's the White House counselor. And this article says that President Reagan today is so isolated from the workings of the White House that he's unaware of the depth of the problems. Now, last week I read the article about the Pope, that he was so removed from the religious people in Rome and running the Vatican that he's not aware of what is going on there. That was the article from the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. This article says the struggle between these officials is going to result in greater power for Baker or his departure or in Meese, but it can't be either ways. We've got to make changes because the administration is in trouble and they have some hard choices coming up. They are in trouble, and it's coming down from every place. That's true. But these men, neither one is going to solve it. But to let Baker win is to give the White House to George Bush and get ready to ease Reagan out. And as soon as he wins the election as a front, if he wins the next election, then his demise will follow quickly afterwards, or he's just a figurehead. This article says that there is no unity in the White House. He has doubts that Ronald Reagan is aware of the situation. I think he's pretty isolated. A handful of people provide information they want to provide, and nobody's in charge. This article is from the LA Times, Jack Nelson, who covers the Washington scene. He said, we've got 4 guerrillas and no one in charge. Alexander Haig says there's a guerrilla warfare there. Now, the LA Times is saying we've got 4 guerrillas and no one is in charge. I don't know why I'm laughing, but except that Ronald Reagan was never presidential material anyway, and how the American people ever let him in, I'll never know. It says, in fact, you'd be hard-pressed to find anybody here who's happy. That's unhealthy in any White House. Well, the only man who's happy is Ronald Reagan. He gets on the helicopter and he smiles on Friday. He comes back on Sunday, he smiles. Everywhere he goes, he has this sick grin from ear to ear, as if he's never had more fun and never been more happy. And yet the domestic scene, the international scene, the cabinet scene is coming apart, and now they're having to admit the problems everywhere. David Stockman would give a figure of a deficit of $115 billion to the president, knowing it was $140 billion, and the president wasn't told about it. The president's not getting information, and he might have to leave Stockman and Donovan out and Watt after the elections of the senators and congressmen that are coming up this November. Well, this bitter fight is really a fight not so much between Republicans fighting each other, but it's between people like Helene vonDamm and the major spy agencies that have worked their way up. George Bush was director of the CIA. He's sitting right there behind Baker, or Baker's his front man. And what you're getting is the conflict of the elected president, no matter how bad he is, the appointments made by a woman who worked with the Galen operation, the chief of staff working for George Bush of the CIA, so that the spy network, equivalent to, say, the KGB or the Gestapo, wants to strangle this country, lead it to World War III, this idiotic old senile president going back and forth munching his jelly beans, and a few old hands holding on to the system and trying to hold it together to make it look like a government that functions. The European governments are ignoring us. There are riots in the Philippines. They're gunning down their people. Our allies in South Africa killed 130 people last week. The government in South Korea is collapsing from scandal. The El Salvadorian government is more sadistic than ever. And next week, when I talk about Reagan and World War III and which countries he wants to send money to, Well, we're getting totally bankrupt in this country. They're all gunning their people down on the streets in a fanatic anxiety to hold the fort, and they cannot spend all their capital on making World War III. It won't work. So that there's this frenzy with the people we call our allies trying to hold their thrones, and each one of them is coming unglued while the President of the United States has 4 guerrillas in the White House that aren't even telling him what's going on. Now, getting back to that bank that I mentioned 2 weeks ago, the FBI agents got unsecured loans. That had to do with Archbishop Masinkas and Luigi Manini from the New York Times article in 1976. And in 1973, they were also suspect at the time. Now, who is Laszlo Gelli and why is he important? I mentioned that Laszlo Gelli is tied to Roberto Calvi in Italy, the man that was just killed. Gelli headed Mussolini's secret service, the right arm of his fascist terror group, the equivalent of the Gestapo. He fought with Franco in Spain. When the war was over, he went down to South America, and then the Duke of Kent, the Queen's cousin, brought him back to Italy, where he was running the government and putting that fascist government behind the elected officials that the CIA, even those people, had put in power. Now, I use names, but I'm going to get a little more graphic tonight because sometimes just throwing names to you doesn't mean very much. And I'm going to give some quotations from a book written in 1961 called Hitler's Heirs. Paul Mescal wrote it. It's a book about where are the people in 1961 that Hitler particularly worked with and what countries did they go to. And this book has 100 that it refers to. Now, I'm just going to talk about one man because he was active in the Republican Party in 1942 and 1952 and 1956. He was at President Eisenhower's inauguration in 1957, just as Laszlo Gelli was at Ronald Reagan's, and they all worked together. Was there at his 1981 inauguration in January. This gentleman was the head of a Nazi group in Hungary. He ran concentration camps before he came to this country. He ran concentration camps in Hungary. And he got a passport, again, out of Naples by the American Vice Consul. He was a war criminal. In 1947, when the war was over, he arrived in the port of New York, where he got a job at a bank in New Jersey called the National State Bank in Newark, New Jersey. Now, I'm trying to find out if that particular bank is changed names because the Security National Bank of New Jersey was linked to the Vatican and the people I've been mentioning. But there was another bank. He came right out of Hungary. He used the American Vice Consul to get him a passport, and he worked as an accountant at the National Bank and worked his way up in the Republican Party. Now, who was this man? His name is Laszlo Imre Agh, A-G-H. 53 years old in 1961. He was in Scott Plains, New Jersey. Okay, what did they have about him? The information about this man was, and witnesses recognized him and brought the attention of the American government, came from Israel and from Hungary. They said he participated in performing activities contrary to civilization and attempting to degrade, humiliate, injure, maim, and kill workers on labor force battalions at the camps in Hungary. Testimony taken from 33 people in the United States, Canada, and Israel said Agh beat and tortured and murdered hundreds of slave workers. He was accused of causing 25 persons to drown in the icy Danube on a single day in December of 44. He sent inmates on death marches in sub-zero weather with inadequate shoes and clothing. He ordered merciless beatings and personal whippings, and the more prominent prisoners, including his former employer and several rabbis. Witnesses said he made prisoners do push-ups over upturned bayonets until they bled to death with the sharp needles. He maimed them or killed them, and another favorite sport was to have the inmates clean the camp toilets with their tongues. This is a man at Eisenhower's inauguration, active in the Republican Party in Cleveland, in New York, in New Jersey. Okay, you get the picture? Brought here from the American Council in 1947. On other occasions, he buried prisoners to their neck in the ground and kicked their heads until they lost consciousness. Aj says he claimed he was a victim of communism. The communists were smearing him, and his associations with the Hungarian freedom fighters were legitimate. The various freedom fighters said that they were the most damning witnesses against him. He fraudulently got his passport to this country in 1947. He claimed his residence was in Austria and Czechoslovakia and not in Hungary. He was active in the GOP. He worked in the Republican Party from the time he was working at that bank. He was brought to a bank in Newark, New Jersey, the National State Bank. He worked for the GOP, as I say, in 1952 and 57, attended President Eisenhower's inauguration. This is the same president who was over there fighting a war to end this kind of thing. And the investigators learned that he was arrested in Hungary going back to 1939 for clandestine Nazi activities. He worked with the Hitler Youth in Hungary before the country ever fell. He helped it collapse. In recent years, American representatives have tried to help him. Notorious people who also were identified later as war criminals came to his aid. There were committees raising money from New Jersey, Cleveland, New York, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to keep him in this country. Friends of OG, AGH. And there was a lot of money, and he was residing in Nutley, New Jersey. Now, Nutley, New Jersey, I believe, is the headquarters of Raymond Donovan. So in Newark, New Jersey, we have two banks where there was a common denominator between these people, too, and between the FBI allowing them to come to this country. I'll just mention it for about 5 minutes before we take the break. In the book, The Kennedy Conspiracy by Paris Flamand, he discusses the Hungarian freedom fighters, that's the group that this Aj came over with, and the links to the Centro Mondiale Commerciale, that's in Rome, where Clay Shaw, he ran the International Trade Mart down in New Orleans, where Lee Harvey Oswald was working and associated in espionage. Getting back to that book that's coming out, we'll see if it includes this part. Clay Shaw was in the OSS. He worked with Italian fascists. He supported the paramilitary right in Europe and then became part of the CIA. And then into this country came to New Orleans, a Hungarian, George Mandel. And then J. Edgar Hoover brought Frank Nagy, the former Hungarian premier, into Dallas, Texas. And he was working with various people from the Fascist International. At the time that John Kennedy was killed, the premier of Hungary was in Dallas. As a matter of fact, there was a man alongside of Jack Ruby who was not suspect but was looked at. He wasn't part of the police department when Jack Ruby shot Lee Harvey Oswald. And if you look at the testimony and the radio clips when Oswald was first killed by Jack Ruby, there was a question, who was that man with Ruby? And they said the Hungarian. And in the Torbett document, the story of Permindex and the links of Rome and Otto Skorzeny, and this again ties to Licio Gelli at Ronald Reagan's inauguration, are these Hungarian freedom fighters who were doing the kind of things I read on the air tonight. I have a library of about 1,000 books on Nazi Germany, and I don't often go into such graphic detail, but when I refer to the banks in New Jersey or the GOP or the passports written by Americans or touting these people as freedom fighters, this country is ruptured by two groups. One are the legitimate people of the GOP who have no idea this is going on, or of the Democratic Party, and then there's the spy group that has taken over that invisible government that's become visible, particularly since the murder of John Kennedy. All these people were involved in the murder of Kennedy. In fact, the book, The Kennedy Conspiracy, that Flamand writes about, names all the people in this particular chapter of the Hungarians, the Romans, and so forth, the people from Rome and Milan, that were later working closely with Richard Nixon, or constantly since World War II. And what was Frank Nagy doing in Dallas? Don't forget that Richard Nixon lost the election to John Kennedy in 1960, and that murder made it possible for Richard Nixon, their boy, to become president till Ronald Reagan, their boy, could get the seat. There is a linear connection between these people, and they're working everywhere. I just cite two banks in the same city, multiply it, and in another week or two after I discuss the war problem, we'll talk about the banks that are collapsing. I think they're collapsing from the inside, and this is part of the intent to weaken America. We'll take a 1-minute break now and go on to some other pleasant subjects related to the above.
And this is KAZU Pacific Grove, listener-supported radio at 90.3 FM for the greater Monterey Bay Area. Thank you, Mae, again. That address is KAZU, Post Office Box 206 in Pacific Grove, 93950. Here's Mae once again.
Okay, now we're going to get into a very light subject before we get to a heavy subject. It's not really light. Nothing on this program is light. But we're going to go to the comic strip, the newspapers. I don't know how many of you have been reading Steve Roper lately, and I wasn't until a few weeks ago. If there's a good world watcher out there who wants to photocopy the last 2 months of the comic strip, Steve Roper and Mike Nomad, that would save me time going to the library. I just started noticing the comic strips August the 8th. It's written by Overgaard and Saunders. But there's a series here where a gentleman has committed a murder on a movie set. And in essence, this is what is happening in the series. The cameraman of the helicopter comes down and kills an actor. And the lines Mike and Steve are talking on the comic strip, and one is saying, I can prove Mr. Wonderful up there is out to kill Keller. They're going to kill him on a movie set. A line said, how can that be? And it said, just read these old times clippings and tell me if you see a familiar name. There's an accident on the movie set, and an actor is playing the part of a Nazi in the movie. But the person who's going to come down and kill him recognizes and knows he's a Nazi war criminal. So they're discussing the activity of how they had to kill him on the set. And one day this last week, on Wednesday the 11th, it said, read it loud, Lori, so the guy on the balcony could hear it. And Lori says, today the Pentagon confirmed another Nazi atrocity committed during the Battle of the Bulge. And then it goes on the platoon led by Lieutenant McCord. All right. And the Battle of Bulge is, of course, something that I'm very interested in. And then it goes on, the Lieutenant McCord is in this article with your father. And it continues each day. It goes on and on. It says, Keller was the Kraut who ordered the massacre. The man on the movie set who's killed during the filming is actually the man who ordered the massacre at Malmedy, who killed this person's father years back. And it tells about how the person responsible for the murder on the set is called to a hospital, and he's told the whole story by a total stranger who's dying. I have all the different strips here, and they say, your old man was killed in World War II, McCord, nearly 8 years ago. This is a long time to carry a grudge. And then there's a picture of his dad's platoon. And he says he was out looking for firewood when a unit of the Waffen SS captured the rest of the group in the woods. Now, there was a strong parallel with the filming of the set to the death of Vic Morrow, the actor, just several weeks ago on the set of Twilight Zone. And I can't save every article. I can always go back, which I did. I can't save everything on every murder, but there was a question of what happened on the movie set and a lot of controversial articles. At first, it was a pat story, helicopter crash in a park, and Mr. Morrow and 2 children were killed on the set. They were using a Bell helicopter. Interesting Bell helicopter, because Mr. Dornberger, the Nazi war criminal, he's dead now, was the director of Bell Aerospace in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And he was brought to this country instead of being hung at Nuremberg. He was working over in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. But the Bell helicopter came down, and there were parallels not only to the death of the actor and the comic strip going on simultaneously. And I didn't think too much of, I didn't know what to make. I thought it was just a natural accident, and maybe it was. But I have a few articles here about the scene in Hollywood and the investigation of Vic Morrow's death. One of them is from the Los Angeles Herald. Twilight Zone probe points to a conspiracy. evidence that two executives on the set were talking about their problems. It's about a possible conspiracy in the production, and they're going to investigate. This is the Herald Examiner, August the 3rd, a long article on how the helicopter plummeted to the ground and exploded, and there weren't supposed to be any explosives on the set at all, and the parents were assured it was all simulated, and all of a sudden the plane falls down on Morrow and he's dead. Another article from the Los Angeles Times, Twilight Zone probe notes the crew's confusion. Now, they didn't know what was happening. It was a simulated Vietnam battle, and they weren't told that they were going to be shot at, and they lost control. And it was not intentional. What happened was not intentional, the newspaper says, but there's a lot of confusion. And another story, the sheriff reopens the Twilight Zone probe. Then another article about actor Vic Morrow has named a friend, George Brand of Beverly Hills, to have $50,000 of his estate. And the rest of the money is in various banks, over one in Zurich, Switzerland. Evidently, Beverly Hills or Los Angeles isn't good or safe enough for Vic Morrow, and it reminds me of William Holden with his Swiss banks and his Kenya connections to Mr. Khashoggi from Lockheed. I don't know a thing about Vic Morrow. I don't see many movies, and I don't watch television, so to me, it's a zero in terms of personalities. I could understand the death of the rock musicians or Elvis Presley or Janis Joplin or John Lennon. I knew what the people were saying and what they were doing, so that it became imperative to study how they died. I don't know a thing about Morrow, but the similarity between his death and the discussions in the comic papers is something to note. I haven't had this called to my attention since Chappaquiddick. And at that time, there was a series that I can bring in and share to you. Probably it's so long ago, many of you don't remember it. But it was about a man who wanted to run for the re-election in the Senate, and he's with a girl who's in a car accident, and she drowns, and his career is ruined, and how's the family going to cover it up? And this was all just about prior to the Chappaquiddick affair, where Mary Jo Kopechne was killed and Ted Kennedy couldn't get the nomination for 1972. The script was side by side. I got a call from a man in San Francisco this week, Thursday or Friday, and he wanted to start subscribing to the tapes. He's a novelist doing a story on computers, and he wanted to take the tapes to take real-life people that I describe, certain characters, and put them into his novels. And you can see how the fiction is taken from factual experiences, and if they take enough tapes and listen to back tapes of the particular broadcast and what I've studied, how he could develop a personality like Fritz Kramer, a secretary like Helene vonDamm, who could work for the Nazis and for the Americans and be in a computer office, and how she could be brought to this country. All you have to do is change the names, and I'm sure that there's certain people knowing what's going on, but Steve Roper is an interesting something to watch. I don't think it's too important, but it might develop because, it's, as I say, it's the second time I noticed it. And just this last week, there was, I can't say the arrest, he's been arrested, that Royal Kenneth Hayes, that fellow that decapitated two people in Santa Cruz. He's been arrested. The woman with him has, all charges have been dropped. And he's the fellow from Hawaii with contacts in Minneapolis. He left a gun in Minneapolis after he did the crimes out here. And I'd written about his partner 8 years ago, 1974, working with the FBI. I did that in one of my published articles. Well, this Royal Kenneth Hayes, I mentioned a while back, you might not remember, it was in the San Jose Mercury, March 28th, 1982. He described the first killing he ever did. Now, this guy had 160 IQ, studied art and music and literature, and is a very well-educated person going to the University of Oregon. And in February 62, he killed his best friend, and he used words that sounded like mind control. He said he didn't want to do it. Of all the people who worked for him, it was his best friend, and he said, I had no way to do it. I didn't want to hurt him or eliminate him, but I had to do it. And his best friend was a man, Theodore Robert Ross, 54, a veteran of the Battle of the Bulge, who was working in an agency, a newspaper agency with Hayes. So this young person out of college with amount of training and pretty sophisticated had to kill his best friend. And the article went out of the way to say the man he killed was in the Battle of the Bulge. Now, while I've been studying that area of military war, and I've been bringing it up every week or almost every week because it's so fascinating, there's more and more references and little things. There's very few people that are, say, murdered by a lone assassin or for a narcotic thing. They say, well, he was at Iwo Jima, or he was in Burma. This name pops out of nowhere, like in the newspaper or in the murder article from the San Jose Mercury. It jumps out at me. I may be missing some I'm not seeing, but they go back to that date, and it seems that witnesses who were there were ordered to be murdered. Hitler had ordered every person that they took to be killed, and some of the survivors seem to be killed, and even it's important enough for a comic strip. And I did try to find the background on James McCord from Watergate, because they talk about Lieutenant McCord in the comic book, and his name runs through the entire era. On the back of his book, it just briefly says James McCord, for 25 years, worked for the federal government from 1942 to 43. These are during the war years. He was in Washington and New York. He was in radio intelligence against Germans and Soviets. He was in flight. His flight duties during World War II took him in special places around the world. So he was a pilot in World War II. May not be the same McCord, but it seemed awfully funny to talk about Lieutenant McCord in that comic strip. So we'll just keep reading it and see what comes along. Now, there is an article that may not seem important for some of you who have not followed the era from Watergate, particularly to the present, but I'm sure it's going to influence a lot of us in time to come. And I sometimes point out certain power blocks that are fighting each other, because we just saw Great Britain fight Argentina over the Falklands, and why Great Britain wanted that was the control of the sea and the water. If you see the map of Antarctica and the oceans that connect down there, it's absolutely essential that Great Britain hold on to Antarctica. As a matter of fact, Otto Skorzeny, who was the engineer of the Battle of the Bulge in Malmedy, was sent by Adolf Hitler and Nazis to secure the Falklands for Argentina a long time ago. And after the war, his role was to try and secure the Falklands for Argentina. But up north, there's the North Circle, the Arctic, that I've never brought up. And there's a battle going on up there that is very, very important. And I won't get into the North Pole except for the conflict of two particular major forces fighting each other and their links to the past. And also this story I briefly mentioned last week began bursting open with another murder, just like the Banco Ambrosiano boat with Roberta Calvi, the president of the bank, being killed in London. A man named Erskine Carter, the director of a company called Global Resources, when flying out of a window in New York City, April 16, 1982. This article I'm referring to now is from the Wall Street Journal, if you want to look it up, July the 20th, 1982. The title is "The Change of Fortune. A proxy battle builds for a firm once scorned by its shareholders." Bear Stearns, that's a large corporate group of holding companies, the Bear Stearns Company, that represents large German banks and multinational corporations, wants control of another company called Global Natural Resources. So we have to get the teams clear now. Global Natural Resources headquarters are in New Jersey, and the Bear Stearns Group is an international group with bankers such as the Warburgs who funded Hitler, and they want control of Global Resources. Now, the Global Resources originally had another name. It belonged to Robert Vesco in New Jersey, and it had control of $50 to $300 million current price of assets up in the North Arctic, in the Arctic Circle. There's as much as 50 million to 300 million for grabs as a starter, but also you control the ocean ways if you have the Arctic Circle at north. And it has to do with oil and so forth in a buildup. And a man who was in favor of giving the development of Global Natural Resources to this particular company, this man that I mentioned, Erskine Carter, when he died and went flying out the window, somebody got control of his proxy slips and gave them to the opponents who now want to take over the country. They delayed the decision from this June until September. Now, Bear Stearns has the control of 1.2 million shares of proxy slips that belonged to Erskine Carter of Global Resources before he flew out of that 10th floor window in New York City. Global Resources is oil and gas exploration, similar up north to the Antarctica in the south. The offices are in New Jersey and also in Great Britain. Summit, New Jersey, headquartered by a man named Frank Beatty. And there's millions of acres in Canada's Arctic Circle, millions of acres. I mentioned the Antarctica being the size of the United States plus Mexico. Now we're talking about the northern Arctic. The Global Natural Resources has been laying low since 1971. They've been very quiet. But it used to be called the Fund of Funds, an organization. Then in 1970, it became Investment Overseas. That's Bernie Cornfeld. Now, Bernie Cornfeld was working with Robert Vesco at the time that the Watergate came down, and they were also working with William Casey of the Security Exchange Commission. The Fund of Funds became Investment Overseas, and then it became the Global Resources. Now, Robert Vesco is floating around. He had taken $243 million from Bernie Cornfeld, and he's floating around, never arrested. He's between the Bahamas and Nicaragua and Costa Rica, working close with his current administration, Richard Allen and William Casey. So his opponent, Cornfeld, has decided to go with Bear Stearns in the fight to take the money out of Vesco's hands, to take it from Global Resources. Now, what I'm saying is that there was this corporation in New Jersey. They laid low for years, and then they were going to tap from $50 to $300 million of oil and gas. And in the meantime, one man holding a chunk of proxies goes flying out a window, and the proxies go to the opponents who are not in New Jersey but who are in Germany to take control of the Canadian Arctic Circle. Now, the Arctic leases were not yet developed. They were putting them off, and I'm sure they were putting them off until the oil prices went up and the scandals of Watergate subsided. According to the Wall Street Journal, Bernie Cornfeld and Robert Vesco worked with Frank Beatty in Summit, New Jersey, and he held on to these stocks, and now Cornfeld wants a comeback fighting Vesco. And what they're saying is, what is so disturbing about the fact of the Global Resources is the possibility that Robert Vesco might control the shares to pull the strings for Global Resources. Now, if you want to know about Robert Vesco and how he wants these hundreds of millions of acres in the Arctic Circle, I could be graphic and tell you about his role trying to take the Dominica Islands recently that was subverted, and also working with John Connally and the grand Nazi organizations from Canada, the Ku Klux Klan. They were going to turn the Dominica into a haven for narcotics and prostitution and Nazi publications to go all over the world. This is Robert Vesco. And one of the things they were going to do is to go to Africa and bring black people to Dominica Island to shoot them as hunting. Animals aren't interesting enough. Deers aren't interesting enough. Killing seals or outside of Canada, or penguins in Argentina. People who love the natural wildlife are so outraged when animals are killed. And yet they must be reading the same morning papers I am about Robert Vesco and Dominica Islands. I can bring you the dates and the times that these exposés came out. And there's this total silence about this operation of Vesco. Now, would you let a man like that have hundreds of millions of dollars in the Arctic Circle above Canada with unknown faceless corporate heads who aren't even named? Now, Vesco was once a director of Global Resources. He set it up. After Watergate and taking from Investment Overseas Company his $243 million, he went, as I say, to Costa Rica and Nicaragua. Pardon me, it was $224 million, but he parlayed that into other millions of dollars. And there's been no change. They were waiting until he could tighten up. People would forget who he was, and probably maybe he would have had his Dominica Island by now, and they wanted another stronghold. Well, Bear Stearns came in, and as the Wall Street Journal said, they're good at proxy wars themselves. it is a war when one of the men with so many proxy slips goes flying, as I say. So the global were staying quiet for a while, and in come Bear Stearns. And who do they represent? The M.M. Warburg, Brinkmann, Wirtz and Company, German bankers. And this is why I want to know the bank that Helene vonDamm's husband works for in Germany. Is it one that Hallmar Schacht from Hitler's bank had, or the Schroeder Bank, or is it the M.M. Warburg, Brinkmann, Wirtz and Company? Because is the woman making all the appointments in the White House keeps the same name as a banker in Germany who's working in this can of wolves, in this kind of an operation? You see, she's so closely associated with George Bush of the CIA, and who had more expertise than to, say, float people out of windows for the past 30 years and get the proxy slips into the hands of a German bank? Who has the expertise for that except for the CIA? The KGB can't even pull something like this. So Bear Stearns is representing M.M. Warburg, one of the big bankers that funded Adolf Hitler to begin with, and Warburg, Brinkmann, Wirtz and Company, the German bankers. And they are trying in this proxy battle to take over completely from the Vesco gang. And going into that side is Bernie Cornfeld with the German bankers. Now, this cast of characters would be more interesting if some of you would go to the library and get books, biographies on Robert Vesco, and some on Bernie Cornfeld. He wrote one, Do You Sincerely Want to Be Rich? There are good biographies out about these men and these banks, but particularly these men. And you get the visual picture of those people opposing each other, in case you were too young or too old or weren't aware of this at the time of Watergate, and the role they played, because again they work closely with William Casey, who is the director of the CIA at the present time. And it is for a monopoly of oil and minerals and gas and the Canadian Arctic up in that area. Now the Bear Stearns brokerage has lots of millions of shares. They're going into this confrontation pretty soon, and the question raised in the Wall Street Journal are, who are the stockholders? You have a hidden group of stockholders that Mr. Beatty will not and is not able to locate. So we're talking about 50 to 300 million with a team of track record that is notorious. And I'll read some more about the Global Stearns Group in criminal investigations and hanky-panky going on in this country. The hidden stockholders they can't locate. They're laying low, but they have a choice piece of real estate, say, equal to a hunk of Antarctica, certainly bigger than the Falklands, containing strategic areas, and the potential is tremendous for controlling oceans, minerals, oil, and having their own little, what they say, global resources. They're not kidding. It's called global resources right now. Now, people helping Bear Stearns against global resources are the Lehman Brothers and Kuhn Loeb, you know those names, the Hambre Bank of London. That was linked to Michael Sindona, Roberta Calvi, and the royal family of England. Their money is tied up in the Hambre Bank, and that also was one of the banks that funded Adolf Hitler. D.F. King and Company in New York is the firm hired in this proxy struggle. They're trying to get a vote to see who controls all of these goodies. The Bear Stearns want to take over, or the global resources, and the global resources made a quick move to break up some of their holdings to acquire a company in Houston, Texas called McFarland Oil. They were going to pay them $44 million in cash notes in exchange for 3,250,000 shares in Global. So quickly they were trying to get their gang together by incorporating with an oil company in Houston. Bear Stearns blew the cover of the Houston operations, the Wall Street Journal said, and said, today is the day we're going to take our gloves off. We're going to go in and hit Mr. Beatty of New Jersey with the whole Vesco stuff. So there's not only four guerrillas in the White House, but you have the transatlantic confrontation where Cornfeld and the multinational bankers that put Hitler in power are fighting Vesco and the drug dealers and the international swindlers in America. And it is, if it weren't sad, it would be funny, and it really is funny, because they can't handle each other's problems. See, the global resources waited 11 years thinking, now we'll pull out our secret stockholders. We'll wait till the Watergate wears over. We got Reagan in, we got everything we want, an attorney general that won't expose us. In the meanwhile, the system is coming apart. It's getting unglued, and each one is willing to tell stories on each other. Now, the Bear Stearns said, we are reliable. Besides the German banks, we've got the finest people for the proxy election, and we'll sever ties with scum people like Robert Vesco. So they want to bring W. Marvin Watson in. He was a former U.S. Postmaster General. He's the former Occidental Petroleum Corporation director and was president of Occidental Petroleum. Now that brings in Arm & Hammer and another can of worms you wouldn't believe, but it gets more complicated because Marvin Watson is from Arm & Hammer's group linking up with the German multinationals for the oil up in the Arctic. They want Marvin Warner. He's the former U.S. ambassador to Switzerland, chairman of the Great American Banks Corporation, at a time when all the banks are going broke and the Swiss banks are under investigation for the drug dealing, the narcotics, the dummy fronts. The collapsing of the legitimate banks can be directly caused and blamed to the setup of the Swiss banks after World War II for skimming money, and again tying it into the Vatican, to the churches, to organized crime. Another man with Bear Stearns is John Bertoglio, Bertoglio, major stockholder and director of the Ennox Incorporated in Oklahoma. Now, I read the Ennox, E-N-N-E-X company in the news this week, and before I came to the station, I couldn't find what article I found it in, but that is another huge scandal that will link to this. So if any of you go to the library, look up the New York Times, the Ennox in Oklahoma, at a time when the Penn State Bank has collapsed in Oklahoma. This fellow is involved. He is founding member of the U.S. Football League, owner of the Birmingham, Alabama Football League, part owner of the New York Yankees, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I told you a little bit about him last week. Now, there is this battle going on. The global resources takes each one of the men I've mentioned and mentions Mr. Warner, his involvement with federal charges and schemes to defraud federal customers, and a bank in Fort Lauderdale, a problem with the Century Bank there, and scandals trying to take over Marshall Fields and other corporations. The global resources attacks Mr. Bertoglio and James Ling of the Ennox Company in Oklahoma for judge criticizing their tactics. They were brought before the courts for attempted to acquire Texas International, and there was subterfuge there. They made an out-of-court settlement. They've been in trouble distributing proceeds of Texas International with assets of $100 million. And the Global Resources Group are attacking the captains of the Bear Stearns Group of being involved with corruptions, problems in courts, failed to meet financial obligations. What you have are a group of thieves fighting another group of thieves, except one is passing themselves off as blue chip. Now, later in programs to come, we'll go more into these characters like Bernard Cornfeld and Robert Vesco, but the Wall Street Journal found it important to have an article on this. And again, what set the news off for all of us in the paper was the murder of a man who held over 1 million shares of Proxy. The system is getting so desperate that they have to even kill the front men, take their Proxy, and let the chips fall and hope you won't notice it. But the method of assassinations to gain control, whether it's the company or the country, and the use of narcotics as the incentive to gain millions of dollars and then parlay it into oil money or mineral money, or the grab for a landmass in Canada that is so huge, the Arctic Circle in Canada. The implications are tremendous, but the loser is us, because we pay a high price for the oils. These people will have lands for experimentation, for exploitation that nobody can examine, just as Antarctica is a military base, nobody can visit it privately. They have an area to continue the Fourth Reich. The people behind these groups work directly with Hitler's agents, Reinhard Gehlen, and Hitler's intelligence agents, and they connected narcotics money with oil money, with religious institutions such as the Vatican and Swiss banks. So when they fight each other, you get a glimpse of what they're doing. You can't get it by walking into a boardroom meeting, but when the Wall Street Journal has an article like this, you get a glimpse, just as when Watergate came down, how one faction fights each other. It was not Democrats against Republicans. It was the Republican Party fighting other members of the Republican Party and getting caught at some of their dirty tricks. Well, it's a complicated story, that one on global resources, but because it goes back to Bernie Cornfeld and Vesco, and because Vesco's very much alive, floating around with hundreds of millions still, and very much a political figure in islands in the Caribbean and now wanting the Arctic Circle. The hidden people on that board are not recognized yet. Keep your eyes open, and anything that follows, and there will be articles, send them to me in case I miss them, and